Welcome to Eat, Drink, Think. I'm Amy O'Neill Hauk. In this podcast from Edible Communities, a network of magazines published across North America, we celebrate all things local and sustainable in the food world. With the title of Chief Sourcerer at Dandelion Chocolate, Greg Delisandre's job title alone gives off a bit of magic and whimsy. And when it comes to this beloved food and ingredient, a little sorcery doesn't seem out of the question. Greg was a product manager at Google over a decade ago when his love of chocolate led him to become part of the team at Dandelion Chocolate, a bean-to-bar chocolate factory in San Francisco. This made-in-San Francisco local treat could not be possible without two global ingredients, cacao and sugar. Greg's job is to travel to where the cacao is grown, meet the producers, and choose what to buy that will end up in Dandelion's single-origin chocolate bars and confections. There's so much to learn about this adored ingredient, so let's get started. Greg, welcome to Eat, Drink, Think.
Thank you so much, Amy. Really exciting to be here.
We're glad to have you. I'm wondering, can you give us a little backstory? How does somebody end up with what sounds like the best job for a travel and chocolate lover?
It is a pretty phenomenal job. I mean, you know, there's bumps in the road, and I mean that literally. Overall, it's great. It started. I met Todd and Cam, who had gotten Dandelion Chocolate started in 2010, and I had planned to actually make my own chocolate company. This is while I was working at Google at the time. And I planned to make my own chocolate company, and then I had met the two of them, and we had kind of talked about like, well, if we're both starting chocolate companies in San Francisco, why don't we join forces and do it together? At the time, we didn't necessarily have a vision of exactly what Dandelion would become. We had a lot of ideas that many of which have come to sort of fruition. But in terms of our focus on single origin chocolate, and so like where the beans come from and that sort of thing, what we had was a pile of beans in the corner of a room that like when I started, they were like, hey, do you want to, like, someone needs to go through that pile. And I was like, I could go through a pile of beans. That's when we really get started. At the time, we had no idea about cocoa. I mean, we knew what most people knew, which is like it grows in the tropics. But beyond that, I think didn't really know that much.
Well, and that's actually a perfect lead into my next question. I mean, chocolate's my main vice. I have some nearly every day. And I think I still don't have a crystal clear understanding of how it goes from plant to treat. Can you walk us through at least the first part to get started, the growth and harvest and fermentation?
Oh my God, I love talking about this topic. Absolutely. And although the one thing I would say is I'll describe it and I'll try to give you the sort of like sensory experience that you might get. But if you ever have an opportunity to go to a cocoa farm, take it, because so much of this, as with all foods, is what you experience through your senses. And so even like the way a cocoa farm smells and the heat on your skin in that farm, all of these really sort of like, you know, help kind of like define the experience. But to just kind of get things started, cocoa does grow in the tropics. So the tropics are 20 degrees north and south of the equator, you know, between the two tropics, as they say. I am currently in Hawaii, which is at about 21 degrees, and we do grow cocoa here. So it's an approximation, and actually with climate change, those numbers are shifting more and more. I know of cocoa growing in Saudi Arabia now. Some's growing in China, Japan, places that aren't sort of thought of as tropical. But it's cocoa grows on a tree. I know people say like money doesn't grow on trees. Well, chocolate does grow on trees, and that's one of the things I really love about it. It grows in these kind of, I would say, football-sized pods. And if you're listening to this in Australia and you're assuming a football, or Europe and you're assuming a football is what we would call a soccer ball, imagine then a rugby ball. So it's kind of like an oblong pod, you know, around the size of a shoe, maybe. And they can be a little bigger, a little smaller. They come in these wild colors, really bright. They can be in like reds and orange. I've seen sort of like teal blues, green. There's this really like wide spectrum of colors that they grow in. And actually what the pod looks like will show sort of the genetic variety of the tree that it's growing on. And so from the look of a pod, you can kind of tell what kind of cocoa tree this grew on. Cocoa trees themselves originally started in the Amazon, and so they're happiest among a bunch of other trees, very little wind, in a calm, cool, warm space. Not unlike human beings, if I'm going to be honest. I mean, that sounds pretty nice to me too. So these pods also, fun fact, grow on the trunk and thick branches of the tree. This is because they're so heavy, and so they evolved to grow this way. And they don't have that like natural break point that most fruits have. So if they get ripe, they will not fall off the tree. If they get ripe, you have to cut them from the tree for them to come off. And so this means that cocoa is the harvesting of cocoa is very manually intensive. There's no automated way to do it as of today, all done by hand. So when you see somebody advertising that their chocolate is harvested by hand, that's just marketing. It's all harvested by hand. So once the pod is harvested, you break it open, and on the inside, there's a white fruit surrounding beans on like a corn cob shape. And I always say it looks kind of like what I imagine the guts of an alien might look like. It's this perfectly white and kind of like, sort of like wet looking thing. Turns out the fruit is incredibly tasty. It tastes very much like a tropical fruit, like a lychee almost. And that fruit, though, is very necessary to take these beans from being essentially a seed that can grow a new cocoa tree into what we think of as dried cocoa beans. And that's the fermentation process. So what happens is that fruit, and because this is grown in tropical environments and often in very poor countries, the technology used for fermenting cocoa in most of the world is what's called a heap ferment, which basically means you take all the beans out of the pod, you put banana leaves down on the forest floor, you put a pile of cocoa beans on them, and you let the natural microorganisms and yeast in the air act on them. And so what happens in this case is it's a two-stage ferment. The first stage is yeast eating away at this sugar to create the sugar in the pulp. It's part of the reason the pulp is so good. It's very sweet, to create alcohol and heat. And then you have acetic acid bacteria and other types of bacteria that are taking that alcohol in the presence of oxygen and converting it into acetic acid. And then this acetic acid soaks inside the beans and starts to create all these flavor precursors that form the flavor that we know and love. If you take an unfermented cocoa bean, it doesn't taste completely unlike chocolate, but definitely doesn't have the same nuance. I think, Amy, if I remember correctly, when we were talking before, talking about like all the best things in the world are fermented. Like you name it, and if you love it, it's like the complex flavors of cheese and, beer and chocolate. All of these really complex flavors come from fermentation. And so that fermentation happens, and then you have to dry the beans so that they're dry enough to be able to ship to wherever you're going to make chocolate. And sometimes that's nearby, and sometimes that's across an ocean. And so that process is where you get kind of like the dried cocoa beans some people have seen. It takes about 2 weeks all in to do. So this is not a short process, and it's a very skilled process. People hear like, oh, it sits on the forest floor, so people just, throw it there and it doesn't matter. No, like people really understand like the heat that's coming off of it. So when to turn it based on the temperature or what it's smelling like, and if it smells like a good ferment or a bad ferment, and how to adjust those things. And so there's a lot of, as I mentioned before, sort of senses involved in tuning those fermentations to get really great flavor.
Okay, so many questions, but one is like when you're talking about the fruit, it made me think of flowers. And what are the flowers like, and do they smell nice?
Oh my God. I love that you ask about the flowers. The flowers of cocoa trees are sort of an unsung hero. They are tiny. So they're smaller than the size of a like thumbnail. Right. So there's very, very tiny flowers. And the reason this is so important is it means they can't be pollinated by bees. They're only pollinated by midges. So these flowers are so small that they can only be pollinated by these really tiny insects known as midges. And so it also means there's no such thing as cacao honey out there, because if bees are not pollinating cacao trees, there's no way to sort of generate honey based on this. And so they're little tiny flowers, and they cocoa pods themselves, I know I'm gonna sound like a numerologist here, but cocoa pods themselves have like 5 lobes on them, and the flower itself has 5 petals on it. And so you can kind of see over time how this tiny 5-petaled flower sort of like then morphs into this kind of 5-lobed pod. And so it's kind of fascinating to watch. And then it go from a flower all the way to a fully grown, size of a shoe/football pod is about 6 months. So they grow like relatively quickly. And then in kind of like as they grow and as they're evolving, a sort of immature pod is called a chirelle, which I always think is like a 60s band, and maybe it is a 60s band. The chirelles are but then I imagine as a 60s band that are little like tiny, semi-formed cocoa pods with like headphones on and sunglasses.
I mean, a beehive hairdo, kind of like a cocoa pod. Right?
Yeah, the beehive hairdo, like made from the stem from the flower, as it like AI can generate this for us, I believe.
It's your next Halloween costume, I think.
It's definitely. I'm going to be a chirelle. But yeah, and, the flowers don't have much scent to me, but the fact that midges find them makes me suspect they have a scent to the midges. Of some sort. But I find them very beautiful. I know a lot of people have like cocoa flower tattoos. It's just so interesting because they're so small. I think most people don't have an idea what a cocoa flower looks like, because you really have to zoom in close to see it. And like I've tried to do some hand pollinating, and hand pollinating is incredibly hard. And you need to have like, essentially like a needle to do it. And it's, I'm not very good at it.
So I guess I'm curious if cocoa plantations require a lot of inputs or when they're growing the fruit. And also when you were talking about the fermentation process, it sounds like most of the fruit gets used up in that fermentation process, but are there any edible byproducts?
I'm going to start with the second question first. There are definitely edible byproducts. So you do need the fruit to ferment the cocoa beans, but there's this question of how much of the fruit do you need? And so for instance, at Dandelion, we use pulp that's extracted, and you have to freeze it immediately, because otherwise it'll just start fermenting and you won't have fruit. You'll have vinegar or wine, depending on how, what it does after that point. So you have to freeze it immediately. And so we make like a smoothie out of it. It's super tasty. It's really great. And again, like very tropical fruity. So it's a combination. It's a unique flavor. So it's kind of like, how would you describe a lychee if you never had a lychee? The answer is, well, it's like this, it's like that. So now I'm describing cocoa as like, well, it's like a lychee and maybe a little banana in there. Sometimes some apple you taste in it. And so depending on the genetics of the cocoa tree, each one has a different amount of pulp to it. And so there's a certain amount of pulp you can extract before you won't be able to ferment the beans very well with it. And so there's kind of this balance. I think I mentioned I live in Hawaii, and in Hawaii, a lot of people they refer to it as nectar here. A lot of people will use that nectar, even as you're taking it out of the pods, as you take the beans out of the pods, you'll immediately see the fruit starting to become more liquid and run off. Even within a couple of minutes, you start to see this happening. And so what a lot of people will do is they will just put those freshly pulled or freshly extracted beans in the fruit into a bin a clean bin, and then just collect all what drips underneath. The other way you can do it is run it through a centrifuge to sort of like extract more. But it's funny because in parts of the world, I'm very good friends with Brian and Simran, who run Cocoa Alchemy in Tanzania, and they get these same drippings, but they don't have a market for it, so they like put it into the road to keep the dust down. And it's like every time it like breaks my heart and I couldn't drink the quantity that they pour into the road, but it breaks my heart because it is this like really like interesting and tasty thing. There are also people, so I've seen like, I know Lidgate Farms out on Kauai makes popsicles out of it, which is, like the perfect popsicle. It's got a lot of pectin, so it makes an incredible sorbet. Like it gives this like really creaminess to a sorbet that's often missing if you don't have some sort of dairy base in it. And so like a cocoa fruit sorbet is like a perfect sorbet. And then you can make wine and vinegar out of it. So I have bottles of wine and bottles of vinegar in my home that have been made from cacao fruit. And it's like a lot of fruit wines. It does not taste like grape wine. Cacao fruit has actually a lot more compounds, or a lot more aromatic compounds in it than grapes do. So when you drink it as a wine, it's a little overwhelming, where you're kind of like, this, I get that this is wine, but there's so many things going on that you're not kind of expecting to drink from a wine. So it's good, but it can be overwhelming at times. And then I totally forgot the first question. The first question, remind me again what the first question was.
Yeah, I was curious about what kind of inputs are required on a cocoa plantation. Yeah.
Well, so cocoa is by and large smallholder farmers. And so unlike a lot of things like sugarcane, so a lot of the sugarcane in the world is grown on very large plantations. Cocoa is, I would say, more than 95% of the cocoa in the world is grown by smallholder farmers. This is people with 5 acres of land or less. It also is growing in a lot of the poorest countries in the world. And so this means that a lot of people can't necessarily afford inputs. So I think while cocoa can take fertilizer and irrigation and all these things, it did grow up in the Amazon. And so as long as it's raining pretty consistently, and there's good, there's sort of good soil, it can grow pretty well. Unfortunately, this does start to, like, for instance, the cocoa price, and we might get into this, the cocoa price is very high right now. Part of the reason for that is climate change. And so while people are used to not necessarily putting a lot of inputs, putting in fertilizer or irrigation, when the weather has become very chaotic, suddenly the trees are not, the trees need more consistent water than they're getting. And so they're seeing drought systems and then, flooding, neither of which is great for cocoa. Not to mention, cocoa doesn't like salt water very well. Again, Amazon, right? It didn't know what salt water was. It never found it until someone brought it to one of these great wide oceans. And so when you do have more flooding, sometimes you can end up getting brackish water with the flooding, which is not great for cocoa trees either. But in general, the majority of people in the world are not putting inputs into cocoa. The majority of people in the world are, the cocoa trees grow. And I would also say, because a lot of people listening might have an idea of a farm is like straight rows, what I first imagined, which is like a farm, like a cornfield, right? Or like long straight rows, massive field. When I say cocoa farm, it looks like what I think a lot of people would think of as a forest. So trees, not necessarily in specific rows, but with a lot of other trees near it. Again, grew up in the Amazon, loves to have its siblings around, or cousins around, I should say. So a lot of shade trees around it, nitrogen fixers like Gliricidia and all these other trees kind of like nearby. So it doesn't look like what a lot of people think of as a farm. If somebody said, come into my cocoa farm, they'd start walking into a set of trees and you'd be like, wait, but I thought I was going to a cocoa farm. And so I think it's the first thing I learned, and this was in Belize, the first time I ever went to a cocoa farm, which was like almost 20 years ago, is that a cocoa farm does not look like what we think of as farms in the US.
So let's talk a little bit about the process once the beans are fermented. I guess, and you can let me know too. I'm a little bit curious if the farmers are also usually the fermenters or if that happens somewhere else. But once we get past that, if you can talk about what is bean to bar chocolate and how is that made?
Yeah, absolutely. So quick answer to the question is sometimes farmers ferment their own beans and sometimes there's somebody else ferments the beans. As with so many things, there's kind of like different structures that exist in the world for that. And then bean to bar chocolate, which is, what Dandelion and so many other people in the world. Right now, it's hard to get an explicit count, but the guess is somewhere under 1,000 bean to bar makers, but probably over 500. And there's a lot of local ones, like people might have their own sort of local chocolate makers that they know. When we say bean to bar chocolate, what that specifically means is that you're getting cocoa beans, so these fermented dried beans that I just described, and then the very quick process is you have to take the seed coat off, the shell off of that bean. What you're left with is cocoa nibs. And so when you're eating a cocoa nib, all it is a broken up cocoa bean. You can roast it as well, and roasting does it sometimes improves flavor, definitely improves food safety. And so roasting is a thing that a lot of times people will do either before or after taking that seed coat off. Taking the seed coat off is referred to as winnowing. Winnowing is something done in a lot of industries. And then all chocolate actually is taking that nib and grinding it down. And as you grind it down, a cocoa nib, imagine like a peanut. It's half fat. So when you grind a peanut down, you get peanut butter. Cocoa nibs are exactly the same thing. You grind a cocoa nib down and you get what's referred to as cocoa liquor. I don't, to be honest, know exactly why liquor was the term given to this instead of like paste, like cocoa paste or something, but everyone calls it cocoa liquor. So you grind it down into cocoa liquor. And now what you have is you have all of this fat with these like other particles kind of suspended in it, just the same you have with peanut butter, right? And from there, you can add sugar, you can add other ingredients to it. Technically, to call it chocolate, you have to add some sort of sweetener. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but the way the FDA works is in order for something to be called chocolate, it has to be a combination of cocoa beans and a sweetener. We make 100% chocolate that's literally just ground up cocoa beans. And I think we technically call it our 100% bar. And it still tastes great. The sugar, one of the things the sugar really does, or the sweeteners do, is it helps to kind of like, I talk about it as if it's like music, where if the music's up too loud and you've set all of the, treble, bass, etc. to the peak, what ends up happening is you can't hear anything because everything gets kind of like distorted once it gets to that, that high enough sort of volume. It's the same thing is true with flavor. If you're eating something and there's nothing to attenuate those flavors, you end up getting this sort of like too intense experience, and you don't really experience all of it because there's too much happening at once. And so that's what the sweetener does, is it really kind of attenuates that experience. But yeah, so what we do as bean to bar makers is we get cocoa beans, we take the husk off, we roast them, we grind them up, and we put some sweetener in. In the case of Dandelion Chocolate, we put in cane sugar from Brazil, where I have actually visited where our cane sugar comes from as well. And then you grind it down so there's a particle size on average around 20 microns, which is the right particle size so that in your mouth it doesn't feel gritty or sandy, but it feels nice and smooth. But if it's too small, if you grind it up too much, it also has a bad experience. If you grind it up too much, it almost tastes like eating like something that's too fatty, like foie gras or something. Mm-hmm. Not that foie gras is bad, but it's just like if it like the experience of foie gras is like something's like very fatty on your tongue, as opposed to this kind of like smooth experience you're looking for chocolate. And that's all chocolate is, just ground up cocoa beans.
Does the fat content vary from bean to bean?
Yeah, a lot. So the fat content, we always think of like the fat in cocoa beans as kind of like the sweater that the plant grows to deal with, like wet weather variations. And so where it's colder, you tend to get a little bit more fat. And then where it's not even colder, where it's like less consistent in terms of weather, you get a little more fat. And when it's more consistent in terms of weather, you get less fat. And so like the beans we have with the least amount of fat are the ones like really as close to the equator as possible. Actually, the ones from Ecuador specifically. And it's not just more and less fat, it's different fats, right? So fats are a combination of all these different acids. And so you can have softer fats and harder fats, just in kind of the same way that you can, like every cheese, like the fat in different cheeses will give you different textures depending on, a variety of things. Same thing is true in cocoa butter. It's not as wildly different as cheese is, but there is a lot of variation into the kind of like the mouthfeel of the fat depending on the bean. What a lot of chocolate makers will do is add the same fat into the chocolate to make it easier to work with and kind of makes it more consistent. And it means that as a customer, you end up getting a more consistent experience. We do not add extra fat at Dandelion. And so that means every bar, the texture of every bar, depending on the origin, is actually slightly different. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time sort of experimenting with and learning about and trying to understand, because some people will be like, oh, I can't put my finger on it, but I like that origin better than that one. And sometimes it's not the flavor. Sometimes it's that mouthfeel, because, those are kind of the two elements of chocolate. I mean, maybe you could say almost any food, but certainly chocolate is there's the texture and there's the flavor. And it's like those two things combined are the experience for it. And so if one throws you off, then it kind of like ruins the whole experience,
So you just hinted at origin. So for most of your bars, maybe all of your bars are single origin chocolate. So for listeners who've never had single origin chocolate, can you talk about what they might discover? And also, have you ever been tempted to create a blend? Because wow, I just can imagine like when you think, oh, this one would be so good with that one if you mixed a little bit,
You're totally right. And we did have a blend once. And I'd love to say that it was intentional, but I'd be lying. It was that like someone accidentally put two different sets of beans together. It was a like complete accident, right? Beans all look the same. They're brown, right? And so they like put two sets of beans together and we were like, oh my God, we have a double origin. What are we going to do? And the answer is we sold it. And it was like people like loved it. And
can never do it again.
We were right. It was Madagascar and Camino Verde. So we called it the Verde bar, and it was a big hit. I think for anyone who hasn't tried single origin, you are in for a treat, because what single origin means is that all the beans are coming from sort of one place. And the reason I say one place is it could be a single fermentery. It could be a single set of farmers who all ferment their beans together. So it's origin, it doesn't necessarily mean a town. It doesn't necessarily mean a farm or a business. It's kind of just a homogeneous set of beans. And we have a sourcing report online. If you go to Dandelion Chocolate, we have a sourcing report online, so you can kind of read a lot more about some of these origins. But the reason we do it is the more sort of consistent of where the beans come from, the more intense the flavor you'll get from them is. The nice thing about blending, and I think a lot of people perceive that small chocolate makers are fighting the big guy. And I don't know that it's a fight. I think we're trying to do something different. So what large chocolate makers are trying to do is make a product that is consistent over the course of decades, which I think is wildly difficult, because imagine how much plants change over the course of those decades, and the weather has changed, etc. And what a lot of consumers want is they want consistency. They want to say, when I bought a Hershey bar 10 years ago and I'm buying another Hershey bar today, I want that experience of those two things to be exactly the same. And I understand why some consumers want that, and I understand why larger businesses want to provide that. What we're trying to provide is the diversity. What we're trying to say is there's a lot of different flavors in chocolate that are not what you think of as kind of classical chocolatey flavor. In fact, when you're describing the flavors in chocolate, chocolatey is an actual descriptor because it's that like classic chocolate flavor that people are used to. And so what it means is that you can have different chocolates, but they can taste very different and give you these like great different experiences. The way I often talk about it is like the way you get consistency is you destroy nuance. And this is true in so much in life, but it's especially true in food. So if you want something to be the same all the time, what you do is you remove any of those like little nuances that I think make it interesting, but it's consistent. And so you kind of have to go one direction or the other. You either have to say, I want nuance, I want inconsistency, or say, I want consistency, and then what I'll lose is nuance. The example I often give of this is burned toast. If you burn toast, was it wheat bread? Was it sourdough? Who knows? It's all burned, right? And so like you've destroyed the nuance that bread had, but what you've given is a consistent flavor. And so the thing that we're trying to do with single origin chocolate is like really like provide that nuance and provide a little bit of the sort of the flavor of the region of where it came from. And so it gives people, we like to think, and we might be right, what happens is that in tasting chocolate from from Tanzania or Uganda or Vietnam or Brazil, you get almost transported there. You get to have a sensory experience that came from a very specific place and get to sort of enjoy that. And I think in many ways it does spark the imagination of like, oh, like where did this flavor come from? And what does this taste like? And when people taste like chocolate from India, a lot of times they can taste kind of like Indian spices in it. And is that like in your head, or is that something that's actually in the chocolate? So there's I think I love the sort of the way chocolate sparks the imagination in general, but I especially love the way it sparks the imagination when you have single origin.
I'm curious if you have mechanisms in place to protect you from getting a little too like rarefied and winey, and wine as in drinking wine in your descriptions. Like it is chocolate after all.
It's funny. We also get whiny, not the like. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of whining all to go around. But it's hard because like. It's like you both want to be like, you want to be something that feels approachable. Like the reason we make chocolate is because we want people to eat it. We don't make chocolate to like buy and sit on a shelf. We make it because we want people to experience this, to really like taste it and love it. At one point we talked about like jewelry store chocolate, which is chocolate that's kind of like designed to be seen and not tasted. And like we really want people to feel like I have this bar that like when I tasted it, it changed my experience or my understanding of what chocolate is. Like that's what, frankly, like I really love is like when people sort of like have that change. But yeah, at times it's like we can get into our own heads a little bit and say like, wait a minute, this is like this specific flavor note. And people are going to be like, does anyone know what that is outside of, but like to some degree, I think it's also like we talk about flavor libraries. So when you're tasting chocolate, what you're tasting is chocolate. Like there's no bones about it. You're tasting like cocoa beans and sugar. You're tasting chocolate. But then you'll say, oh, but I taste nutmeg or I taste orange. And so like what you're doing is your mouth or your, not just your mouth, like your mouth and your nasal cavity and your sort of like, your whole body is kind of connecting the experience that you're having to a previous experience. So that flavor library is built up by what have you eaten in the past? What you think of as a strawberry and what I think of as a strawberry might be very different flavors because I'm used to having strawberries that are like, frozen, and you're used to having strawberries that are fresh, or you're used to having like less ripe strawberries and I'm used to having more ripe strawberries. And so like, it's when someone says strawberry, there's no such thing as just strawberry. Strawberry is like a collection of experiences that everybody in the world has that we kind of all describe the same way and are saying it's around the same thing. And so in writing flavor notes and kind of like talking about it, it's the same sort of thing. Like, how do you communicate to somebody what your experience of eating this bar was based on, like, you know, your flavor library? Like, it's a pretty complicated topic, you know, and so, and one of the things we do in training people is we help them build flavor libraries. You have to very intentionally. I think for a long time, people thought the only way you could be like good at you know, tasting things is if you have, you know, a great palate, or you're a super taster, meaning you have like a higher ratio of taste buds on your tongue. And the answer is, it's like anything, it's practice. And if you're intentional about it, and if you are like, if you don't just, you know, shove food in your mouth, which I do a higher portion of the time than I would like to. But if you're really like thoughtful and intentional about it, you can build that flavor library yourself. And, you know, one of the things I like about 70% dark chocolate is you kind of are, it almost forces you to be intentional about it, partially because it's like, if you just chew it and swallow it, it kind of like, you got to give it a little time to melt in your mouth, which basically means you can't just, you know, shove it into your pie hole. Is that okay to say on here? Mm-hmm. So I like that chocolate forces you to slow down a little bit with your food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, chocolate is such a delight, so it's a little uncomfortable to have to pull back the curtain and take a look at some of the challenges surrounding its production that can range from, socioeconomic to environmental to ethical. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through those a little bit and maybe share how Dandelion has chosen to navigate them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and you're right. I think, like, you know, one of the things that's like impossible to ignore is that chocolate brings joy to so many people, but that's not true for all the people who grow the cocoa. I hate to say it, but I think it's true for a lot of things that we eat in the world. Like, I think first and foremost, food does not, in the United States, I should say, the perceived value of food is too low. And so people think it's something that you shouldn't spend very much money on. And when people feel like you shouldn't spend money on it, what they're basically saying is the relative value that this has to a car or a house or something else I could spend money on is lower. Interestingly, and, you know, so Dandelion has a factory in Japan, and we have some stores in Japan, and we make chocolate there. In Japan, there's actually a lot more sort of willingness to spend money on food, because I think it's seen as kind of something more valuable, especially like artisanally made food. But I think in the United States it's not. And the reason I say all of this is because cocoa grows in the tropics, it does mean it's growing in parts of the world that are some of the poorest parts of the world. Because also it's a tree that can grow without a lot of inputs, without irrigation, and you can intercrop it, meaning you can grow it with food that you're growing. A lot of the poorest farmers in the world grow cocoa because it's a way you can make a little bit of money. But the problem is, it also means, so that's kind of how it started. And I think, like, in many ways, you know, cocoa grew up through the Amazon basin, where it sort of emerged, but also in like central, what is now Central America. It started to become domesticated a lot more, and in, you know, Ecuador, etc. And for a long time, the people who ate cocoa were the people who grew cocoa. And this is even true today in like Belize and Guatemala and Mexico. A lot of people who are growing cocoa are just consuming it themselves. Once it turned into sort of an international commodity that was associated with colonies at the time, and was associated with sort of Europeans decided that they had a taste for this thing that they could get from colonies, well, that's where the sort of power imbalance really started. And then that power imbalance in many ways remains today. And so what this means is that the people growing cocoa don't get paid very well for what they're growing. Now, it's interesting that we're having this conversation now because like this has changed a lot in the last 2 to 3 years. But up until about 3 years ago, the commodity price for cocoa hadn't changed substantially in about 50 years. That's almost like saying, imagine if you didn't get a raise for 50 years.
So you're not saying adjusted for inflation. You're saying the actual price.
No, yeah. I'm saying not adjusted for inflation, the actual price. And you can look up the graphs. It went up and down because it's a commodity, and so it goes through. But, in the late 70s was this huge spike in cocoa that brought the price from, at that point, it was about $800 a ton to it went up to a couple. I want to say it peaked at around like $8,000 a ton, but like adjusted for today's rates, that was like $25,000 a ton. So it peaked around there, and then it came back down and settled into somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 a ton. So it went up, but then that settling into $2,000 to $3,000 a ton remained for about 50 years. Now. This is where it's tricky because I think everybody wants to feel like there's a bad guy involved. Everybody wants to say somebody is keeping those cocoa farmers down, and if we can just find that person and their heart will grow 4 sizes that day or something like that, then it all fixes. Unfortunately, it's like this is a systemic issue because there's there's a commodity price. And so what happens is the whole supply chain assumes that this is the price that you pay for this. And so there's not like a single person that says, well, I want to keep farmers poor. That nobody's goal is that. I think, and I know that there are and this is why it's a challenging topic, is because I think it feels like when somebody is not getting enough money for the work that they're doing, and in many cases, well, I shouldn't say many cases, in some cases, that means if you're a person who owns land and you're not getting enough money for the product that you make, and you have people working on your farm, you don't give them money. Or you have your kid help before or after school, or if school takes a really long time to get to, sometimes you have your kid help out during school. And so I think first and foremost, it's important to sort of approach this topic as there's not a set of evil people in the world who are trying to screw over somebody else. There's the systemic issue that people don't pay enough for food, and then that money goes down a supply chain where at every step of the supply chain you get less and less. And this is part of the reason buying local is so important, is because in buying local, what it means is there's fewer steps in that chain for the money to get to the person who's actually growing something. But the longer the supply chain, the more sort of money is taken out at every step, that you then end up with farmers who are trying to make ends meet, and they're trying to do what they can. I think it also personally makes me really sad that if I go to West Africa, and I've been to Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, which are the 2 largest growers of cocoa in the world, the first thing that some farmers will say to you is, "Don't worry, I don't have slaves. I'm not abusing children." And just to know that there's a person that they see, and if you're listening to this podcast, you might not know, but I'm white. They see a white guy like me, and the first thing they feel like they have to do is justify that they don't have slaves is terrible. It's terrible that both, as a system, that some people have been driven to this, but also terrible that we've just painted such a broad brushstroke on cocoa farmers that they're like, yep, if I meet somebody, I'm assuming they're going to think that I abuse children. I think I say in the United States, it's kind of similar, and these are hard topics to talk about and hard to hear, but it's kind of similar if somebody met someone from the United States and said, and the first thing you had to say is, I've never shot children in a school. Right. And, because they're like, well, if you're an American, I'm assuming all Americans are shooting. Like, I've heard about all these kids getting shot in school. So I'm assuming if you're American, you shoot kids in school. I think it's the same kind. It's like, and this is the way I always try to approach things is like see it from somebody's perspective. And how could you relate, even though you've lived such a different life? I think, so assuming that and I've seen stores say, we won't buy any chocolate from people who use cocoa from West Africa because West Africa has labor issues. But I don't think that's a solution, because there's a large number of farmers who are making ends meet by selling cocoa. And in saying, don't buy any cocoa from anyone in West Africa, this very broad brushstroke is basically saying, we think all of you are doing something wrong. And so that's where I think it gets really complicated. I will say that both in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, there's laws against these things, and they're really trying to figure out how to reduce the incidence of child labor. And again, the worst forms of child labor, what specifically people are looking to do is reduce the ensure kids are going to school. So kids aren't working instead of going to school. That's like one of the biggest ones, but also making sure kids aren't working in dangerous situations. That also gets tricky, because how do you define dangerous? Kids using a machete is often considered dangerous, but also for anyone who's spent a lot of time in the developing world, kids using machetes is it's pretty common, because that's the tool you need, including to do things like kill a snake, if one's around you. And so it's a really complex topic. I think the way we approach it at Dandelion, because it's such a complex topic, is first and foremost, we get to know all of the cocoa producers we work with. And so instead of buying something from a catalog or buying something, off of a list, we get to know the people involved. One of the reasons for this is now, and I've heard people say this to me, and it's true. How do we know they're not lying to me? How do I know that I don't meet somebody and they're lying to me and they got 12 kids in a basement that they're, using to harvest their cocoa? And the answer is, how do you know anyone's not lying to you? That's what you do, is you spend time building up trust and building relationships and trying to get to know people so that you have a good sense for who they are and how they'll react in situations, but also so that if they're driven to a hard situation, they'll talk to you about it, instead of saying, well, those Dandelion guys just need our cocoa, and so we have to do whatever it takes to get it there. We want to build a relationship so they can talk to us about it and say, hey, this year's been a tough year, this is what's happening. We don't know that we have the amount of cocoa you need, or we're going to have to raise the price that we agreed to, or any of these kinds of things that stop people from needing to feel like they have to do something, that is outside of what they sort of would normally want to do. The other thing we do is we pay more. And, a lot of this really just does come down to, there's always going to be some bad actors. There's always going to be somebody who is going to try to keep more money for themselves or something like that. But in general, if cocoa farmers get more money for what they're doing, there's less incentive for them to be pushed into a situation that they almost certainly don't want to do, and we wouldn't want them to do, such as not paying workers, and in the most extreme forms and I've never met anyone who has experienced this, and I've never but apparently there are forced labor that exists somewhere in the cocoa supply chain. I've spent a lot of time in West Africa, and I haven't run into it. That's not my way of saying it doesn't exist. It's just it probably exists somewhere, but I've never ended up interacting with that. But so the thing we do is build relationships, pay a really good price for what people do. I think the hard part also gets into then when the price goes up for we already were paying high prices, and now when the price goes up, we need to pay more, but we also want to make sure that we're still paying even more to incentivize people to sort of that to sort of behave in a way that like we all agree is like appropriate.
I think you mentioned in your sourcing report that with the change in prices, some growers have chosen to hop over to the commodity market and some have chosen to stay with you.
And I don't blame, I mean, again, like I'm super excited that cocoa farmers are getting paid more money. Like this is like, this is kind of the thing we always wanted. We started about 15 years ago and we always talked about cocoa farmers getting more money, and they're getting more money now, which is awesome. I think it's a little tricky as a business to figure out like, okay, well, our second highest like cost after labor is cocoa, and that cost just doubled over the course of a year. That's hard. Like, it's definitely hard to figure out how to run a business, but I think it's good for the industry as a whole because it's resetting what people think cocoa is worth. And like, that's really, really important for the industry to sort of for that reset to happen.
And it sounds like demand isn't going away either.
Yeah, I think so. There's people trying to make kind of like cocoa alternatives. Like some people might have had carob as a cocoa alternative. I see your face. I don't think that carob.
I'm from the 70s, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We all had a carob chip, and we're like, "What did you just feed me, Mom? Like this is mean," And like, yeah, exactly. I'm in the same boat where it's like at some point I had a carob chip, and I was like, I felt like I got tricked. Like it's kind of like when you ate like a game piece from a set because you thought it was candy, and you're like, that's not candy, that's a plastic toy. Yeah. I apologize to all the carob farmers out there. And so some people are doing that, but like overall, like people's love for chocolate is not going away. And does it mean that maybe chocolate becomes a little bit more of a like luxury good? And there's not quite as much sort of like candy? Well, it turns out if you look on shelves, that trend was already happening. You were already seeing kind of like the chocolate coatings are thinner, and there's, while there's chocolate-based candy, there's a lot of like gummies have become very popular, and like a lot of non-chocolate based candies have become very popular. And so there is, so I think like, all of this I think is good. I do feel bad for the chocolate makers because a lot of them, I personally know a number of chocolate makers who have gone out of business because they've just said, with the additional prices, and then in the United States with the like chaos of the tariffs that are happening, it's like very difficult to try to run a business. And so some people have just said, hey, I don't think I can do this anymore. And that's sad because when you're in an artisanal industry, like that variety is what makes it interesting. I love that like 100 people can use the same beans from Cocoa Cameli, but every single bar tastes different and everybody has their own take on it and what the flavors they love and they pull out, and like that's what makes the industry so interesting. And so it like hurts my heart when I see like people going out of business because, market forces sort of are forcing that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Well, let's hop back to that delight for a moment. Why is chocolate blissful? It feels like magic, but is it actually science?
Yeah, there is some science to it. There's a lot of compounds in cocoa that are specifically, and the main one we talk about is theobromine, which are like, which is specifically interactive with human beings. And so when people talk about how like chocolate is poisonous to dogs, it actually, the reason it's poisonous to dogs is the same theobromine. I think there's an expression of kind of like the poison is in the dose or something like that. And the same thing is true for theobromine. So while in humans it's a stimulant and it creates a sort of like very slight sense of euphoria. In dogs, it can kill them. And so I always say that like one of the things I love about cocoa trees is they have this kind of way of that they're kind of perfectly made to pair with human beings. So both the theobromine can kill other species, but for us, we think it's great and we like the experience it gives to us, but also the fact that chocolate melts at the temperature inside your mouth is the fat in cocoa beans have a specific crystal structure that happens to melt at the temperature inside your mouth. This is not true. I mean, like coconut oil doesn't do that. Peanut oil doesn't do that. You name all these other oils, they don't have that same quality. So there's something about like cocoa trees and humans that were like kind of made for each other. But yeah, I think there is a lot of the joy people get out of chocolate. There's a chemical basis to that, as well as there's sugar in it. And there's usually sugar in it, and sugar, people like sugar too. But no, the cocoa itself does something. And, I was at Burning Man one year, a couple of years. We had a cocoa camp at Burning Man. And one of the things we did is we gave people handfuls of cocoa beans that they put in their water bottle. Burning Man is very hot, and so like everything melts there. And so you can't giving out chocolate just seems mean because now everyone just has chocolate covered hands. But so we gave out cocoa beans, and people put the cocoa beans in their water, and they were like, wait a minute, what am I putting, like powdered, ingredients in the water? The cocoa beans both gave it a nice little flavor, but it also gave this, it kind of kept people awake and, kind of had this stimulant aspect to it as well. So yeah, I think cocoa, I have definitely felt what I would call drunk from having too much cocoa. I probably am someone who has as much cocoa as anybody out there. But I've had so much that I definitely felt, that kind of drunken feeling from it. So it definitely has an impact, but outside of just, it's tasty.
Well, hopefully you can still have your chocolate and drive.
This was not a warning to don't eat chocolate and then drive. But the other thing I will say, though, as a stimulant goes, it takes a longer time to hit you. And so it's not necessarily as good as coffee of I need a hit and I want to stay awake, but it's really good if you want to stay awake for a longer period of time. But I'd also say that if you have someone, you're like, no, I need to be more awake. And so then you want to eat more and more. That's not a bad thing. Follow your heart.
Awesome. Well, I understand you've started a new project because you felt like you wanted to do more in the global effort to mitigate climate change. And can you tell us a little bit about that? And is it related to chocolate?
Absolutely. Well, it's related to food systems and cocoa. So I have a new company, Terraton, that, as you mentioned, I was with Google before I was making chocolate. And some of the people that I knew from back in my tech days and I have started this business together because, as many know, climate change isn't coming. Climate change is here. Scientists basically are saying we need to get somewhere around 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide less in the atmosphere per year by 2050. And part of that comes from reducing emissions, driving electric cars instead of cars with internal combustion engines, all of the things that we're doing to reduce emissions. But we also need to pull carbon dioxide out of the air. Well, turns out plants do this really well. The problem is plants will then die and either, they can burn or they can decompose, but all of this re-releases carbon back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. So what we have done is we've built a business to work with agricultural producers around the world. So we're mostly focused on people in emerging markets, such as Ghana. Our first facility, in fact, that we're working with is in Ghana. And what you do is you take plants and you take plant waste. And so in this case, that pod that we were talking about that looks like a football, that external pod, normally that's put back in the field and decomposes. But even in decomposition, you're re-releasing carbon dioxide. You're re-releasing carbon into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So what you can do is you can heat that up to a point that it would burn, but without oxygen, and you'll form what's called biochar. It's a pretty simple process. People have been doing it for thousands of years, literally. There's just more technologically advanced ways to do it today. And that biochar, turns out, because it still has all that same cellular structure, what you've essentially done is you've forced all the compounds that aren't carbon out and you've locked the carbon in. So now the carbon doesn't have a bunch of, without getting too technical, the carbon doesn't have a bunch of like points that it can combine with oxygen to then be re-released into the air. So it's stable in the ground for hundreds to thousands of years. But also this biochar, because it still has that structure that the plant formed, it turns out it's a good home for microorganisms. It holds water in the soil. So for people who don't use or can't afford fertilizer, it's actually a really good way to help enrich the soil, even without using like chemical-based fertilizers that, or even organic fertilizers that people often use. So this kind of combines a couple of things, both in terms of it's more income to bring into these communities where people are in agriculture. And as we talked about, like money is a big aspect of it. So it's basically getting them money for the waste stream that they're producing in the form of carbon credits. But it also then creates a locally made soil amendment that can actually really help the soil. So all of these things, sort of like combine together. And so that's kind of why we're doing it is we know as a planet, we need to pull carbon dioxide out of the air. And personally, I'm excited for this to happen in places where, like if you in the middle of Ghana can do something and get paid a carbon credit in US dollars without ever having to ship something anywhere, everybody really wins in this. And so we're working with commodity producers, so people who have organic waste all over the world. Our very first facility is going to be Three Mountains Cocoa in Ghana. So this is somebody that Dandelion works with for cocoa. But, they work with 2,000 farmers in 8 communities. These communities are super excited to build a facility so that they can really contribute to solving climate change, but also can have more jobs, more income, more money, and sort of biochar the soil amendment in their communities. And so we're actively working on building that today. It's been exciting to be able to combine the technology side of things with the sort of agricultural supply chains to try to build something that we as a planet really need.
It is cool because oftentimes when we think of carbon credits, it feels very not tactile, not really grounded. Yes. This is literally something you're putting in the ground. So,
yeah, no, that's exactly true. I think a lot of people, when they hear carbon credit, it's like, but what exactly is that? Yeah, it's like, what's happening? And a lot of times what carbon credits are, when you talk about nature-based projects, is you're saying, well, if you give me $1, that reduces the likelihood that these trees will get cut down. And while statistically I understand it, it also doesn't feel very satisfying to me. Versus if you're giving me $1, what that means is that you've paid for this cocoa pod to turn into biochar so that carbon is not going back into the air. And the thing that we're doing as a company, as Terraton, is we're instrumenting all of this hardware so that you have all the data to know that it's happening even halfway across the world. And yeah, I love the aspect of somebody knowing that if I'm paying money, this is then what's happening. And I'm not saying that we also don't need trees. Clearly, we need trees. Trees are really good, and it's all kind of all hands on deck. We need to do everything we can to remove carbon from the air. But I'm really excited about taking this approach because I think it really fills a gap in the market of people wanting to be able to do something. And there's so many entrepreneurs in emerging markets, so many entrepreneurs that I already personally know, but more out there who want to build businesses, but they need the resources to do it. And a lot of them, they would need to find customers. And so one of the things that's great about this is we can build these facilities and we can sell the carbon credits on behalf of them. And so they don't need to build a relationship with Google, who buys a lot of carbon credits. We can build a relationship with Google and talk to them about it, and they don't have to ship it anywhere. It's really exciting. I'm very very jazzed about it.
Yeah, no, I like what you're saying about well, it's the difference between paying someone not to do something. As a parent,
Yes.
I have actually literally paid someone not to do something. It's not always super effective.
Right.
But this is,
totally.
you're paying someone to do something, and it feels like, it feels productive. It feels good, I think. I can say, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people think of fighting climate change as, oh, we have to like make our lives worse. I guess is like fundamentally the way a lot of people think of it. And like, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, there's changes we need to make, but like, if the change we need to make is like we can pay people living in rural Ghana to do an activity that makes their lives better and gets them money and also fights climate change, like kind of a win-win-win, you know?
Cool. All right. One more question. What is something you wish people knew about chocolate?
Oh, wow. Something I wish people knew about chocolate. I think the thing that I think a lot of people see chocolate and like food in general as kind of like an artistic process. And like I think the thing I love about chocolate is this perfect blend of science and art. I always say that there's all of this kind of like high school science involved in making chocolate, from like, physics to chemistry to fluid mechanics and, all these kinds of things. And so I think the thing that I really love about chocolate is the chocolate makers. I mean, I love chocolate. I love eating chocolate. I have a bar right here that I'm eating. But the chocolate makers themselves are these problem solvers. And so I think, I love that it's this thing that everybody sees it as, oh, it's just food. And you're like, no, there's this world of these fascinating humans out there who are all these really clever problem solvers, figuring out how to make this really complex thing so that like it just sits on a shelf and you can eat it sometimes later. And just like looking at those, like the chocolate makers behind it and then the cocoa growers behind it, like growing food is not just like, I put something in the ground and it shows up to market. It's like, there's all of these, like, they really have to be very skilled at what they do and really have to understand a lot about the science behind it. And that's what I love about chocolate, is like, it's this supply chain of really smart, clever, hardworking people that makes this thing a reality.
Awesome. Well, in addition to enjoying our next bar of chocolate, we can also just have tons of gratitude for that whole chain of people pulling it together.
Absolutely.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us at Eat, Drink, Think.
Amy, thank you so much for having me. It was really great to chat with you about this, and it's always good to talk about like all of the different sides of my personality, from chocolate to technology, and so I appreciate that.
We've been speaking with Greg D'Alessandro of Dandelion Chocolate. Thank you for joining us today at Eat, Drink, Think. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to pick up your local Edible magazine. You can find show notes for today's episode at ediblecommunities.com.